Hey everybody, Elizabeth Nader back with you, Jersey First TV. We have on one of our favorite guests who always makes us smarter when we talk to him, attorney John Coyle. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's always a pleasure.
You are a great resource for us to explain all things legal, and there certainly are enough topics for us right now. But the last time we talked to you was to dig into what was going on with the vaccine mandate, the Osha vaccine mandate. And of course, that turned into a whole lawsuit that went through the circuit courts, and now it found its way to the Supreme Court. So most people listening know, or should know, that there was a ruling on the 13th, which was last Thursday, regarding these lawsuits. So we want to walk through that. You wrote an incredible brief about it that people can go read that really summarizes well how this affects you and the thoughts behind why they decided what they decided. So John, let's start with setting the stage. We have a previous interview on this, but let's quickly set the stage on the two issues that were brought before the Supreme Court. And guys, this is the United States Supreme Court. It's not a state Supreme Court. This is the highest court of the land. So it's the ultimate and last decision maker. So John, let's outline the two, the two cases that were brought before them last week.
Okay, so there's two cases, right? There's a case called the National Federation of Independent Businesses versus OSHA. This is the OSHA mandate. That is the mandate that put in place that said all employers with 100 or more employees have to put in a vaccination requirement for COVID. There was an alternative that the company could try to put in a testing, or there's an exception for people who worked entirely outdoors, sort of. It turns out apparently 9% of the landscapers would actually qualify as working outdoors under this regulation. But this is the OSHA case. That's the OSHA mandate. And at the same time, the court decided what we call the CMS, which is the Center for Medicaid Services, which is the Medicare services, which is the mandate that applied specifically to healthcare workers, right? And this was a mandate that said any hospital or medical facility, or all the way down the line, I'm just going down to hospital, that gets Medicare money has to put in place a mandatory COVID vaccine requirement for all employees. These were the two sets of things. They went in front of the Supreme Court at the same time, and they were both decided last Thursday at the exact same moment. So we've got the OSHA mandate and the CMS mandate.
Okay, so let's point out some interesting things. First of all, I want to point out Judge Sotomayor. She was not present physically for the oral arguments because, why, John?
Because she had COVID. I wish her a speedy recovery, as anybody else who gets sick. Ironically, there were a number of people who were participating on the various sides of states' attorneys generals and otherwise who were there remotely. And the oral arguments were very interesting to hear people who were fully vaccinated and boosted, who were unable to participate in the Supreme Court decision arguments live because they had COVID, arguing for the need for a national vaccine mandate to keep people from getting and spreading COVID. That's all I'll say.
And that's, and I think, that's one of the ironies of all of this, and we're going to dig into what the decisions were, but one of the things that, and I had shared this with you, that I reacted to, I sort of dropped in and listened to some of the oral arguments, and I was amazed at what was taken as science and fact when in fact it's not, to be a basis for how you look at the vaccine and you look at this supposed health crisis. So John, let's get into the decisions. So we have two decisions made by the 9 justices. The first one is on the OSHA mandate for 100 employees and more. What was that decision?
So, and the OSHA mandate was struck down by the court. As a technical section, it was the enforcement of the mandate was stayed, but in all practical terms, the bottom line is the mandate was scheduled to take effect, is not taking effect. Right. That entire OSHA regulation, this emergency temporary standard, we discussed the extraordinary remedy of emergency temporary standards last time we talked, that is now not in effect.
Right. So this is effectively the court saying you cannot use OSHA to enforce a mandate, and this is not going to go forward. Now, that doesn't stop companies within any state from putting their own mandate in place, nor does it really stop another run at this. It's not as though the courts are saying that a vaccine mandate in itself is unconstitutional or inappropriate. They were specifically deciding on whether or not OSHA had the right to put this in place. Is that true?
That's 100% correct. The Supreme Court decides things as narrowly as they can. Yeah. Obviously, the rulings have great implications beyond the specific parties of the case, but they do not, they cannot, or they should not, and they do not issue orders that are broadly saying this can't be any vaccine mandates or things like that. And you are correct that under current federal and most places state law, I want to speak for New Jersey and state law, you can require vaccines as a condition of employment, subject to exemptions and otherwise we've talked about. This does not prevent anybody from doing this. This simply prevents the OSHA from making a company do this. So if your company or your employer wants to put in a vaccine mandate, this opinion doesn't stop them in any way. Yeah. There are a number of big employers and very large companies nationwide, and some that are enormous presence in the state that said we are going to put in this mandate because of the OSHA ruling, which would have put penalties of tens of thousands of dollars per employee per day.
Right.
So it's technically not a mandate. We're going to be fined if you don't do it, but the fines were
enormous. Yeah.
A lot of those companies had said we're not putting in the mandate in because of the court challenges. This is too fresh. I've yet to see if they're going to walk away from this,
right?
Or if they're going to say, well, all right, well, I could put it into place anyway. So other than the fact that the next steps are unknown, we do know this.
Okay. And when we look at the decision, it was a 6-3 split, correct?
Yes, it was.
And how do you summarize the justices that struck this down, their argument and their viewpoint?
Their argument was a really clearly concise one. It had to deal with the specifics of how this regulation was implemented, right? This is an emergency standard issued by OSHA. Anytime you look at a regulation, you look at the statute that authorized the agency to issue a regulation, whether you follow all the steps of the way, and if something didn't follow all the lines, it gets struck down. It can't be implemented. They simply put here that OSHA was mandated to put in place workplace regulations. Okay? They had the justices, the 6 who decided to strike this down or stay it, went through the point of saying OSHA, in its entire history since 1970, has never tried to broadly regulate anything to this effect. There have been 10 emergency testing standards, and only 6 of them have been contested in court, and only 1 had been fully upheld. Right? This is not a workplace problem, is basically what the court said. COVID is not a specific workplace thing, and they even made the comment that unlike something like wearing a hard hat or other requirements in the workplace, once you leave the workplace, you can't take the vaccine out of your body.
That's right.
The OSHA is a blunt tool for trying to do countrywide policy. And in the underlying decisions, we talked about this before, the courts pointed out that President Biden's chief of staff pointed out that this was just a workaround from the fact the federal government couldn't put it. And the court said, yeah, this doesn't work. OSHA cannot be used to do non-workplace regulations.
So interestingly, it was really the choice of the Biden administration to use OSHA to force this mandate through is what fell apart. It didn't work. Do they have, they being the Biden administration, other options? Could Congress put in a national vaccine mandate? Are we out of the woods with this from a federal standpoint?
We try to. You got a few there. They're good ones. No one's necessarily out of the woods. I will tell you that the courts below, the Supreme Court didn't address whether Congress could do this specifically, other than saying Congress didn't do it.
Right.
The question could be: could Congress pass a national vaccine mandate? Probably. There might be a lot of problems with the wordage, how it actually comes into effect, but they probably have the ability to do so for most of the country or in a lot of ways. But we can't lose sight of the fact that our Congress just voted by a majority in the Senate to prohibit vaccine mandates. That had no legal effect,
right?
Other than the fact is, if 51 senators said that we're willing to pass a law that says the federal government cannot issue a vaccine mandate, it's probably safe to say that the federal government will not be able to issue a vaccine mandate.
Will not be able to is different than can they, are they allowed to, is it legally acceptable. So we are sort of hanging on to that 51, right, in the Senate that's stopping this. And of course, the midterms will probably change all of that. So
Right.
state law, and we're still staying on that first decision
Yep.
on OSHA. So state laws, any state in the union that had determined to put in their own vaccine mandate for employers, that still, those laws, if they're not being challenged, are still in effect. This does not negate those.
That's right. This simply is as micro focused on the aspect of the federal government's ability to regulate this. And this in our country, with our constitution and everything, there's a lot more circumscription about what the federal government can do as opposed to the states. And this question comes down to specifically what the federal government can mandate from the top. This doesn't touch anything from the states.
Okay. Now that brings me to the next question, which I think is in the back of a lot of people's minds, which we hear conversations once in a while from Fauci and from Biden. Should mandates be put in place for interstate travel, for planes, trains, etc.? We have that in Canada, we know. So I know this is just OSHA. And again, I'm asking you to project, but if you had to make a kind of a decision today, do you think it would be constitutional for the government to be able to mandate a vaccine in order to fly or get on a train within the United States? And do you see that coming?
Would it be constitutional? I don't think so. I think they could try, right? The broadest sense, and this is generalities, of course, the federal government has broad ability to regulate things in interstate commerce.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And it's an indication that, just as a small example, the minimum wage, right? There's a federal minimum wage that applies not to every company in the country. They can't actually do that, but they can say that if you have a company that has more than X amount of business and you engage in interstate commerce, then we can set a minimum wage for you.
Right.
Okay? There were times up until a few years ago where there were some states that had lower minimum wage. And if you were a company that worked exclusively within a specific state and a low amount of revenue, you didn't have to comply with the federal minimum wage because it didn't have the interstate commerce effect.
Okay.
Could the Congress pass a law and try to pass a law that says, because of the impact of COVID on interstate commerce and blah, 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 that we're going to put in a mandate for crossing state lines, for air, for everything along those lines? They could certainly try. If you look back historically, just about everything that Congress passes has some part in the preamble that says, by the way, this impacts interstate commerce or interstate travel and things like that. There have been a lot of laws that have been put in place by Congress, even some very well-intentioned good ones that tried to do this and say it affects interstate commerce, and the courts have struck those down.
Okay.
One comes to mind, which was the Violence Against Women Act, a federal act that was designed to protect, to put in place prohibitions on domestic violence and consequences for them. Okay? It's a very laudable goal, and it's an outstanding law, and every state should have their own piece of this, of course.
Sure.
But they came back, the Congress said, is this a question for Congress to put in place this type of law for the country? And they said, as a result, victims of domestic violence don't get the education they would have, don't get to move around in the workplace. So it affects interstate commerce.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court said, no, it doesn't. Okay. So could Congress try to authorize something on the basis of interstate commerce? It could. I'm skeptical, not that they would try, but I'm skeptical that it might pass through. But I'm not going to, no one should say this. John Coyle said they can't do it. But
we won't quote you on that, except to say that there's some hurdles they need to get over. And if they were to get it through the Senate, which I think at this point, with the two Democrat senators who are saving our country, frankly, the filibuster and all the things happening there, that probably not. But in worst case scenario, if it did, we've got another Supreme Court fight. And what you're saying is, it's dubious whether or not that interstate clause is really what allows them to do something like that. All right. So we have the OSHA thing figured out. Now, again, to everyone listening, this is a win for those of us that don't want mandates, but this is just one avenue that was tried in a vehicle, OSHA, which was used by the administration to do this. So don't think that the Supreme Court said vaccine mandates are not okay. They said OSHA cannot do this, which brings us to the second decision, which is an entirely different decision. Interesting. This is really an interesting result when you think about it, because we've got justices flipping. So let's go to the Medicare Medicaid decision, which was enforcing this mandate for any healthcare organization that receives Medicare or Medicaid payments throughout the country, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And this is not a test or vaccinate. This is a vaccine mandate. There was no test option in this scenario, right? So
That's right.
tell us what the judges decided in this part of the case.
So in this part of the case, some of the judges, two of the judges who had voted to strike down the OSHA mandate for the reasons we just discussed, flipped sides and said that this is actually okay for the Medicare. Now, it's hard to come back. So I'm going to speak about just in terms of the grounds that they articulated. Right. I'm going to say I'll save my comments for it for later. But Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh switched from the majority of the OSHA mandate to the majority in the Biden mandate, and this time lifted a stay. A lower court had put in place a stay, and the court here said the mandate's allowed to take effect. So as a result, this requirement from Centers for Medicaid Services took effect. Okay, and unlike in New Jersey, if you're a New Jersey healthcare worker, Governor Murphy's executive order put in place a vaccine or test mandate for all healthcare workers a year ago. This supersedes it under federal law. So the executive order from Governor Murphy is put aside, or at least is to the extent it conflicts with this, and this mandate is now in place for all healthcare workers around the country. If your facility wants to get any Medicare or Medicaid money, which is a rather deep pool of money.
Well, and to be clear for New Jerseyans who are in that industry, they did have a testing option. As much as people who are against the mandates were frustrated with Murphy and everything he was doing, in fact, they had a testing option. Okay, they no longer have that. So this actually sets New Jerseyans who don't want this approach, obviously, back a little bit, because now they have to either vaccinate, and that's another discussion of what does fully vaccinated mean, but we'll set that aside for a moment. And then the only option left, as I understand it, is still a religious exemption and a medical exemption. John, how hard are those to get? You're right in that fight.
Well, I will say that specifically within the Medicare, this requirement, the CMS requirement, carved out an exemption for a religious exemption, objection to the vaccination, which is under the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, or a medical disability, which is under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And people who have those exemptions can still apply under this regulation. How hard are they to get? It's something, as you point out, that I'm battling a lot of. It's a two-step analysis. One is whether you qualify for an exemption as a sincerely held religious belief or a medical disability that prevents you from getting the vaccination. And if you meet that threshold, the next step is whether your facility can accommodate you, as to what sort of accommodations can be put in place to deal with this. For most people, accommodations in a typical situation were worked around testing, masking, PPE, remote work, social distancing. The phrase reasonable accommodation means it's pretty fluid.
Yeah.
And some companies, as I've seen through my work, have decided to say that it's an undue hardship. They can't reasonably accommodate anybody, notwithstanding the fact that people have been working through this entire COVID pandemic, especially these, the frontline workers in the hospitals are the people who were wearing masks, gloves, face shields, and tests.
Without vaccines, right.
Without vaccines for 2 years and getting COVID themselves in many cases.
Yes.
And recovering and coming back to work. And they're now, some of them are going to be told, we can't have you work here with a mask, with a shield, with the gloves, with PPE, with testing, in the exact same way you just did for the last 2 years.
It makes you shake your head. It's really hard to understand that common sense. I think your analysis in the brief you did is so interesting, because again, OSHA being struck down because it was really not the right vehicle, but the CMS part of it, if you look at some of the things that the justices said, what you recognize is that they are affirming, whether you agree or not, that this is a healthcare emergency, that the goal of these organizations is to protect people. So they're essentially saying that the vaccine protects. This is a almost like an accepted starting point going into these arguments. Isn't that interesting? Because aren't we seeing more and more, and we're not going to get into this show and analyzing it, but more and more there's question as to whether or not this the vaccine is actually protecting anyone. I found it interesting. Let me quote here what you wrote. What they wrote is saying one such function of these organizations that take Medicare and Medicaid money, perhaps the most basic, given the department's core mission, is to ensure that healthcare providers who care for Medicare and Medicaid patients protect their patients' health and safety. I mean, maybe it's just me, but I'm sort of amazed that this assumption has been made that it's a protection, and therefore law was decided on that assumption. Is that just me, or is that a little bit of a stretch?
No, it's a lot of a stretch, but it also comes down to the limiting function of the courts, right? The judges have, the Supreme Court specifically has said over and over again through all the challenges during this pandemic, it's not for us to decide the medical science, right? You've got a group of 9 judges appointed for life in Washington, D.C., who are sitting there, who aren't elected, who are far removed from these things, who aren't scientists.
Right.
They say it's not for us to decide this. And in a sense, they're right. I mean, they're right in terms of our structure of our government and division of power. There are agencies, the CDC, FDA, New Jersey Department of Health, whose entire focus and entire task is to do this. And when they have expertise, courts tend to defer with this. Now, it would be naive to pretend that these organizations are apolitical.
Right.
It would be naive to talk about this, but the courts are aware of that, and they actually talk about this, which is like, hey, if a particular administration in the state or the federal government is pushing this type of agenda on this agency, well, then if people don't like it, they can vote that president out. That's a little reductionist, but that's the bottom line.
Well, the argument put before the court was not whether or not these are effective, safe, or anything.
Right.
This was not the argument. And I think people get frustrated because they want that to play out, but that's not what the argument was about. That wasn't what was put before them. But interestingly enough, John, I talked in the beginning because I found it ironic. And of course, I wish her well also, but Judge Sotomayor not being there, having been fully boosted, but still catching COVID, and making a statement that I think a lot of people heard, which shocked everyone, that 100,000 children were in the hospital suffering from COVID, when in fact this is not correct. So what that says to me is a point of view of a justice with bad information or a slanted point of view or facts that I would have a hard time deeming as facts coming into a decision, basing that's her point of view. That's just flat not true. Wasn't that shocking to you?
It was, and I don't know whether she misspoke. Justice Alito, in his questioning, mentioned that there were every day 759 million Americans are infected with COVID.
Well,
putting aside, I assume that he was not believing that somehow the country was twice as big as it was, and it all gets infected with COVID on a daily basis. When I heard that, I said, "No, okay, he got it wrong." And as speaking live here, I'm sure that there's things that I may have said wrong. Other than hopefully I'm not off by a couple 100 million factors.
Yeah.
Did Justice Sotomayor simply believe that 100,000 kids have been hospitalized with COVID or from COVID? Let's say that with COVID, from COVID. There are certainly people in this country who believe that. Other than on the Supreme Court, there are people, you don't need me to tell you that depending upon what news you look at, you flip the channel, you see a completely different worldview. And if everyone you deal with has one set of worldviews, and that's your echo chamber you're part of, you might actually think that she's right. There's probably people who heard her say that and they said, "Amen for standing up for our children."
Interesting. It doesn't stop at the Supreme Court. They
No.
are humans just as we are. They make mistakes. They have a point of view. They have a bias that they bring, even if they try not to, clearly, that they bring to their decisions and the way they look at things. One of the things I wonder as we talk about what does it mean to be fully vaccinated, and certainly that conversation is happening and that goal line seems to keep moving. There was a health crisis. I don't know today what I would call it, but we definitely had a pandemic. We definitely have this, situation that we've been facing. When does it go away, John, from a mandate standpoint? Now, that's an interesting conversation because mandates now that have been put in place in states, as well as now we have the CMS one on a federal level. When an emergency is over, when a pandemic has left us, now we don't have a lot of history to go on here, but do these mandates stay forever? What do you think about that?
Well, I will say I'll take some hope and optimism, and the Medicare mandate is still an emergency temporary mandate, right? It is
interesting.
It is not a put in place, full on, etched in stone, needs to be repealed mandate. There are time periods for when OSHA or CMS can issue this regulation, and then they have to go back and do the regular rulemaking steps that they avoided here, right? Rulemaking has to do with public publication of proposed rule, notice and comment and receipt, and possibly hearings are going on for the stuff of this. The Medicare in this case specifically said we didn't ask anybody for input on this who was opposed to this. Right? That's shocking. If I was to put in place a regulation for the entire country, and because these are non-legislative, there's rules and guidelines for when agencies can do that type of rulemaking. And to simply just put out here that said, I chose to ignore it, is shocking to me. And I'm still shocked that the court allowed this to go into effect.
Yeah.
But this is still a temporary restriction.
That's good to know. So I think we need to underscore that. And there is always hope in that as well. Of course, a definition of when we are done with this is also a moving target based on whatever worldview you decide to take. So it is temporary. It will affect every state. So in New Jersey, it has gotten more difficult for these workers in terms of their options. So as we wrap up, John, and this is such a great analysis, I have to give you a lot of kudos. You're very good at explaining things. You're very good. Sometimes you say things that I wish you wouldn't say, but they're true, right? Sometimes I want you to say it's all going to be okay. We're not going to, but you know what? We're navigating all of this with your help. What do you see coming down the pike? Are there other challenges that are going to make its way to the highest court? Is it going to be state-based? You're in this fight every day for individuals. What are you seeing that we should keep an eye on that's interesting, either on a state level or on a federal level?
On a federal level, there's a few that are percolating right now through the courts. There's a federal contractor mandate that is an executive order from the president that said any company that does any business at any way with any federal contractor in any touch, which federal contracts cover an awful lot of people, have to put in place a vaccine mandate, even for workers who are attenuated. If you're a remote worker and you work for a company and that company is part of gets any federal money under any contracting basis, then they have to put in a mandate. That's going to wind its way through the courts. There is an armed services directive, whether the president has the authority to do this, issue it as commander in chief. There are state challenges that are still coming their way through the pike with the new executive orders from Governor Murphy just coming into, just ink is still wet on them. There's going to be challenges to those. This is something that's not going away legally. We've seen that while things are emergency, and we've seen orders issued in an emergency, and then when the period for the emergency passes, our state legislature says you can go and issue it again, and there's a deadline, and then at the end of the deadline they say you can go do it again.
Yeah, right. That's what happened in Jersey, right?
Listen, it's like in Hawaii, there's an executive order. There's a limit on the governor issuing executive orders about emergencies, and they last for 30 days. I think it's 30. If it's 60, I apologize. It's a certain finding period of time. And he had the governor had mandates in place for COVID for a year, and after a year, people kept challenging it in court. And the court said, well, let's wait, because nobody wanted to touch the pandemic.
Right.
And then they finally said, no, you can only do them for 30 days. And what happens? The governor every 30 days issues a new emergency order. The best thing that can happen is what seems to hopefully be happening, which is that this Omicron surge, pandemic, crisis is going to hopefully not be as catastrophic as people feared it would.
Right.
And hopefully that will lead to, I'm not going to give you the medical science, but hopefully that leads to people who have widespread immunity. And then, this becomes, the sooner this becomes just a common function of life. And for some people it is already.
That's right. That's right.
The sooner this becomes just, the flu comes around every year.
That's right.
And the country doesn't shut down.
That's right.
Yeah. We all forget 3 years ago, if you came to the office with the flu, your boss would be like, stay in your office, Germo.
Right.
Like, you wouldn't shut down the office and have sanitizing stations and masking. And
we've lost that. I said that the other day. It used to be 3 years ago, you'd say, hey, something's going around. Everybody's so sick, but you didn't panic. But, as we watch the virus sort of mutate and burn out in a lot of ways and get less, more, it's definitely more transmissible, but it seems to be less intense. At the same time, the government seems to be reaching for more. So I have a feeling more control, more mandates. So we're going to need to talk again. And we will do that. We will stay following you and everything you're doing. Thank you for the fight that you put out there for individuals who are just trying to make healthcare decisions. I know you've got some heartbreaking stories. That's a whole nother show, but I just want to say thank you on behalf of freedom-loving people in this state that you're doing this work. The brief that you wrote on the 2 decisions, where can people find that?
That's a good question. So I wrote a case alert on this. This has just happened so quickly. I wanted to get my thoughts out and get this done quickly. I don't know if Jersey First, if you have the ability to share it, you can publish it and share it.
Okay.
It would be up on my firm's website if I could figure out how to put it up this quickly. It's coming around. Feel free to share it. This is my take. There's lots of people who have takes. This is my analysis of these cases.
It's excellent. It's excellent, and it helps people really understand it, without getting into the weeds. So we are hopeful with all of this, John. Thank you so much for all the insight, all the information. We will have you back in the next fight as we continue to fight for our basic freedoms here in America. But thank you for helping us all understand it. You have a great weekend. You too, Elizabeth. Listen, I have a suspicion you'll have me back sooner than I'd like to have because something's going to happen legally. Hopefully it's good, but I'm here at anytime Jersey First. You need me, Elizabeth, I'm here for you. Thanks. All right. Sounds good, John. Thank you so much. And to the audience, guys, we'll see you in a few days. Have a good weekend.